Well, hello there. My name is Lisette Coly, and I'm the Executive Director of Parapsychology Foundation. And I'm in the enviable position of being with Dr. Robert Morris within the Foundation's library on June 13th, it's not 19, is it? I'm a
It's
little,
at least 20.
I'm a throwback. It's what, 2002? Anyway, let me ask Bob, what's your present affiliation so I don't screw that up?
Okay. Well, I hold the Koestler Professorship of Parapsychology in the Psychology Department at the University of Edinburgh.
And how long have you been there? Or?
Since late 1985.
And you were the primary, the first
The
in
first.
that
That's
seat?
right.
Yes, for sure. Well, could you give us a little bit of your educational background, so particularly how you landed in that seat, what your educational background was?
Well, I suppose, I mean, my first degree was in psychology at University of Pittsburgh, and of course I met Bob McConnell there, and did even participate as a subject in one or two of his early dice throwing studies, and then went on to do my doctorate in psychology down at Duke University. And I knew, of course, that the Ryans were there, and had corresponded with them a bit in advance of going down there, and they made it clear that I shouldn't mention parapsychology.
Were you an undergraduate student at that point during your correspondence with them?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And they really did make it clear.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And my parents had a friend who knew Dr. Ryan, actually had given him a bit of money, and so from Pittsburgh, and so there already was a bit of a connection there. So the Ryans already knew, actually they knew fairly well the people that had introduced my parents to each other. So it was sort of the things were greased
Easy
pretty
transition.
well. That's right. And so I got accepted to do graduate study at several universities, but obviously Duke was the one that I went to.
For
I mean,
sure.
it was an excellent school anyways. And so then I went there and really specialized in another area, animal social behavior. I've always loved animals and so on. So that was my orthodox PhD. It actually was on affiliation in ringdoves.
Ringdoves?
Ringdoves, yep.
Okay.
So they keep the same mate for life, and so I was studying some of the factors that seemed to be responsible for that. And then at that time was also hanging out with the Ryans over at the FRNM, as it was at that time, in the summers, and a little bit, maybe some evenings and weekends and so on, enough so that I was maintaining an active involvement, but not enough to interfere with my studies. And so then finished up my doctorate, and then went on to do 2 more years of postdoctoral work within the Center for the Study of Aging and Human Development at Duke University.
But always having a residual feeling that you wanted to make a mark in parapsychology, or at that point just pursuing your education and your options?
Well, probably pursuing the education in general. When I was close to finishing up my doctorate, I did apply for a couple of posts in comparative psychology, because I would have been called a comparative psychologist then. And fortunately or unfortunately, as the case may be, didn't get them. And so still was maintaining my options when I finished up my degree, while Carl Eisdorfer, who also had an interest in parapsychology, but was interested in supporting good research, basically offered me a 2-year fellowship to stay on as a postdoc. And then about the time I was finishing up my doctorate, there was, it's fairly well known, there was some friction over with Ryan's unit, and several of us left. And so I was one of the folks that left, and in fact just drifted more in Bill Roll's direction. So that was when I started.
More of the survival hypothesis, or what do you mean by Bill's direction? He had, of course, the Psychical Research Foundation
He had the
at the
Psychical
time?
Research Foundation, which was legally bound to be investigating this survival issue. And so I basically started linking up with him some as another place where one could be interested in parapsychology. Because in part Bill's approach towards survival was that you were investigating it from the bottom up. That meant a variety of hypotheses about it, one of which was sort of the super psi hypothesis. And so that was really what led us to be doing some of the work with Lossing Harribins.
Oh, so it goes that far back then?
Oh, yeah.
Because this has been a continuing relationship.
Yep. And he brought Sean over because not only did Sean, he didn't show classical mediumistic phenomena, but would occasionally, reflect what seemed to be sort of otherworld connections, but basically also was a well-functioning sort of psychic in kind of the usual sense. And so part of what we did was to try to design studies to see the extent of some of Sean's abilities, to see whether or not that could overlap a lot with the kinds of abilities that mediums had shown, in order to say, well, arguably, is
there something
enough to be evidence of some additional kind of mechanism above and beyond those that Sean seemed to be showing. And so that then meant that my work with Bill was able to be thematically linked to survival. And certainly some of my early publications, did talk about some of the lines of reasoning involved in investigating survival. But certainly it was also well able to use my training as a research psychologist, as an experimental psychologist, and therefore to be doing, in some respects, fairly conventional parapsychology research.
Now, was that around the same period of time when you did some of the early animal psi experimentations, right? Yes?
Yep, some of that would have been done while I was
still at
Rhine. Some of it was physically conducted over in the Duke Psychology Department.
That's the famous kittens and
the kittens was over.
Harari.
That was all done over at Bill's lab.
Oh, really?
And then
I
once
didn't
again,
realize that.
Yeah, and once again there was the link to survival, because Keith Harari literally showed up on our doorstep, saying, I know you're interested in out-of-body experiences, and he wasn't the first person we'd worked with. We had a research program on out-of-body experiences, because of course that was addressing the issue of whether or not, while still alive, we have some aspect of self that could, in principle, function, above and beyond link with physiological body. So we were at least trying to investigate what kind of psychic functioning, if any, can you show when you're having an out-of-body experience. And we were very specifically interested in a kind of a model of detection, which was saying if out-of-body experiences might just simply be, a purely mental event, maybe containing some psychic functioning, or is there any meaning to the sense that people often have that they, in some kind of spatially and temporally discrete way, were in X other location? And so then if you say, okay, if I feel I'm up in that corner of the room, is there any sense in which some aspect of me is actually up there? And so that led to what we developed as detector studies, which essentially meant if in fact you feel you're somewhere else, can another detector there respond to you? And so that was whence we were interested in whether humans could serve as detectors, whether or not physical devices of any sort might show radiation of one kind or another selectively there. If not, well then fair game. We falsified some notions about what might be responsible for Keith's experience. On the other hand, if we got positive results, then we could look to see, so what kind of detectors, what range of detectors, was there any, what would correlate with them, and so on. And so we had the idea of trying to work with animals. Partly, I was an animal behavior specialist. I specialized in affiliation within animal social systems and so on. And so it was natural to say, well, let's find an animal that likes Keith. And so...
Hence you were using his kitten, was it?
The mother cat that lived right next door to us was kind enough to have a litter while we were considering these things. And so we checked with the people over there, and they said, yeah, right, we've got enough cats. We intend to give these kittens away. And so I brought Keith over, and we just kind of crouched down beside the litter and waited until one of the kittens came towards him.
Poked the nose out,
And then we said, okay, we'll take that one. And then another kitten oriented towards the first kitten. And so then we decided, let's take them both, so that they won't be lonesome. And so then what happened was, because Keith was living over in one of the houses at the PRF, why, we brought the two kittens over, and he...
And you made history, right?
Well...
Now, is it true, as part of the law, what were their names? Were they really...
Spirit and Soul.
Spirit and Soul. Very apropos. So definitely you have, your career is very grounded in experimentalism, but you're particularly well known at this point in your career for education So how did you segue into teaching parapsychology? After this period in time, what next was on your horizon?
Well, there was a post that came up for full-time teaching in parapsychology, funded by a nice group of people called the Parapsychology Foundation, of whom
That's
you may
a
have
good
heard,
plug, yes, okay. Good, good, good.
at University of California, Santa Barbara. And so
Was it a stretch, Bob? Did you like teaching? Had you done much of it before? Or
I
was it a
had-
natural progression
well, I
because
had
of
done some
what you had in
teaching.
your...
Duke really was training people to be researchers.
Mhm.
And they weren't particularly training us to be teachers. They assumed if you're a
Because
good
it's not an
researcher...
always easy jump, right?
That's right, that's right. And they basically said, look, you know, by the time you finish your doctorate, you've had an enormous amount of opportunity to do observational learning, so you should have some idea about how to teach. But despite that, I really did ask and was certainly encouraged by the department to do some teaching. So I actually did teach at Duke. I taught an honors specialized course. I think I taught a couple of them, and enjoyed that very much. But you know, Duke students were very good, and so you know, none of them. One of them I think was on parapsychology, but most of them were about other things. So I already knew that I had some sense that, you know, I enjoyed teaching.
And you had somewhat of a facility for it, which is obviously now,
Well-
you've been responsible for what, 14 doctoral students?
16.
16 now
Yeah.
through your hands.
Yep, 16, and we've got...
And some more in the wings, waiting in the
yes,
wings?
there are probably by September, we hopefully will have added 2 more. And by the end of the year, possibly at least 2 more.
That's quite a
So,
legacy.
well,
Very much so, I
Well,
mean.
there's a
have
lot
it.
of them. They're
For
breeding,
sure.
you know.
That's good.
You
That's
know,
good.
Got some grandchildren now.
That's good.
and so
That's
on.
good. So you found yourself over in Santa Barbara.
Yep, that's right. And so there I was, the formal contract was that I would teach 3 courses a term. And they were on the quarter system, so that basically meant, with summers off, that each year I would teach 9 courses. And so I developed...
Did they give you latitude, Bob, to teach parapsychology? I mean, you had to formulate the whole curriculum? I mean, that's
Yes, it
quite
was-
a tabula rasa, as it were, no?
It was within the tutorial program. It was not within a particular department.
So you
There was
had...
something called the tutorial program, which had originated with the, as UCSB's response to the student uprisings and so on. So they said, okay, we will allow you to major in whatever you want to, if you can put together a diet of courses that would be like one-on-one tutorials. And so the department existed. And, Patricio Rossi was the head of that department,
yes.
as well as head of the film studies department. And so Patricio had actually applied for and obtained the funding for this post.
Yes.
And so I was just simply one of several applicants for the post, and happened to be the one that, which is
Landed
later
it.
on. Yeah, I seem to have the knack for being out of work at the right time. And so
I think you don't give yourself enough credit, but still, it was a happy circumstance, yeah?
And so
For sure.
I was the one, what that really means is I was available
Okay.
at that time. And so certainly we had no children at the time, and so the idea of moving across the country was not anathema
Somewhat,
to Joanna
yeah.
and myself. And so we did move out there and really enjoyed it. The campus was literally on the coast, and I would have students come into my classroom still dripping wet from having been surfing in the
Oh,
ocean.
please.
Little trails of seaweed across the floor, their surfboards stacked outside the classroom and so on. And I'd be teaching people.
Gidget
you know,
does
about-
parapsychology, is that what you're telling us? No?
Yeah.
Somewhat. No, from Santa Barbara. Does my memory serve me correctly that you moved on to Irvine at one
That
point?
was right.
Yes.
It was down to UC Irvine. At Santa Barbara, the PF supported us, the post there, long enough to give it a good chance
Of
of being
surviving on its
accepted
own.
by the university. And so there came a particular time whereupon the university was told, look, you have to now make your decision. This has been on campus for a few years. Is it good enough
Is it going to
keep?
fly or not, yeah?
And so there, the luck kind of went in the other direction, because it was right after, I think it was Prop 13, which was something that was voted on by Californian people, which restricted the amount of funding available for higher education in the state of California. And so all of the universities were then put under fairly strong funding constraints.
So it wasn't necessarily a total rejection of parapsychology
That's
in your
right.
work. It was
That's
always returning to money.
That's right. And in James McClendon's book on deviant science, he has written up basically a bit of this and what happened next. But we have the report still, and the report, because they did put psychology staff members into the class, you know, to really evaluate the whole thing. And they wrote actually a mixed but nevertheless overall very positive report on the thing. And they said, you know, somewhat to our surprise, yes indeed, it looks to us as though the introductory course well deserves to be on the academic curriculum and probably one of the advanced courses, maybe
So
a
we were very
consolidation.
close, but no
Very
cigar,
close,
right?
that's right. And they
That's a
said,
shame.
however, because of the funding cuts, we feel the university has to stick to meat and potatoes and dessert has to wait for a while. Now, they could have found another excuse. Life has no control groups. But,
Right.
but at any rate, they were kind enough to phrase it in that way.
In that fashion.
And so in the course of trying to find, you know, other employment, I then went down to something else that was an offshoot of the student uprisings, which was down at the University of California, Irvine, because they had essentially a small but real fraction of their staff appointments each year were student-nominated faculty. And so that then meant that they would hire people that had actually been nominated by students for a year of teaching there.
It's an interesting concept.
It was, and it seemed to
Really?
work fairly well. I believe I followed Carlos Castaneda,
Wow.
and Joe Long came along afterwards.
Right.
And so that took me there for a year and enabled me to both teach once again, but also do research in both cases.
Right, so you
the
always had your
university-
feet in both
That's
camps,
right.
haven't you?
The university's always provided research facilities, and I always was in a position to sponsor sort of like undergraduate research projects, where I could even interact with some people doing their doctorates, primarily down at UC Irvine, because I was brought down there by a trio of students working for their doctorates. And
Ah,
that
so
was-
these were the seeds, really, of what you've been able to
yeah,
culminate
that's right.
at
It
the
was,
chair.
It was Mark Schaefer and Mike Winkelman.
Oh, wow. They've
and,
gone on, haven't they? Yes.
Yep,
and-
that's right. And Karen Lundquist. Those three were working on the doctorates there, and so they actually, I'm told, stood up in front of a mixture of students and faculty and made the case for parapsychology in general and me in particular to come down and do this. And then I stayed on for a second year, partly once again funded by yourselves and so on, for a research project. And I believe that also was the origins of the famous book on synchronicity.
Yes, well, yes, okay, which is soon to be on a shelf
be
by
on a
you.
shelf, yeah, that's
We're
right.
smiling in that perhaps our audience won't realize that this is a long promised tome, but timing is everything in life, and
That's
this too
right.
shall
And it will
come
be
to.
an even better tone now
Exactly,
than it would have
exactly,
been then.
exactly. But now, how did you, because your career is geographically, now you made the bound to, what, Syracuse
I get
University?
to follow a lot of basketball teams.
Yes,
Yeah,
I
that's
think
right.
so. You must have a lot of jerseys, school colors, different school colors in your
Yes,
closet. So how did you get to Syracuse University?
Well, that turned again on funding by James McDonnell, who was in charge of McDonnell Douglas Aircraft. And Mr. McDonnell, when he'd been very young, had had an interest in both psychical research and aeronautical engineering, and was undecided about his own career. And his father said, well, they both sound like interesting things. You might make a bit more money with aeronautical engineering. And so
Very intuitive.
He did.
Yeah, okay.
And so he really was in a position then to be, he'd been following me, and apparently did that to various people in the field, and so he actually had sent us a small amount of money, just, you know, unsolicited, unannounced. And then basically whenever it became evident that, you know, I wasn't going to be able to stay on at UC Irvine longer than this, why, he basically called me to St. Louis and interviewed me and said, okay, you know, I'd like to support you going somewhere, and named 4 universities I could go to. And so of those 4, Syracuse seemed like the best bet.
The best marriage,
Because, as you know, there was Lou Rudolph and Ed Storm, who were there in the School of Computer and Information Science, just starting to get things up and going. And so their backgrounds were in mathematics and information science and so on. They knew a bit about parapsychology, but not that much. And so it seemed to me that I could make more of a contribution there to help something new get up and going, rather than to join things at Washington University or even down at the Rhine Center or with Chuck at Princeton. And so I went to Syracuse, and then mostly started off doing just research there, but then gradually started to do some teaching there as well. And as it became evident also that funding wasn't going to last forever there, and I also got some
recurrent
help from
theme in
yourselves.
parapsychology.
That's right. And the recurrent theme was the PF, to the rescue as best you could, and so you were able to be helpful there as well for some research support, and I was able to get additional contributions to my salary from teaching. And so I really wound up teaching a course on sort of exceptional human experience or anomalous experience, which then was mostly parapsychology, but also was able to include some material on sort of anomalous human factors, circumstances, people interacting with
And you were very
equipment.
wise, right, semantically, to call your laboratory what, the communications laboratory?
Yeah, it was the communication
Rather
studies
than
laboratory.
necessarily parapsychology. Didn't alarm people.
Well, it certainly was consistent with what we were doing. It allowed us to really be studying sort of frontiers of human communication. And that was fine within the School of Computer and Information Science. We even had some work done through that laboratory that was fairly straight, human factors type stuff. And so, and that was not a problem. We had that flexibility. And also, I had very good relations with the Department of Psychology at Syracuse University, who did express their gratitude at our having the human communication, communication studies lab. And so that then lasted us for about 5 years.
And did the Koestler chair, was that while you
It
were still,
was-
come up, that opportunity
came
come
up,
up
and
while
so
you were at
once
Syracuse?
again, I managed to,
Be in the right place at the
be
right
in
time?
Yep, be on the verge of being out of work at the right time and so on. So I was supporting myself just, partially there with, some research funding and some teaching money when the chair was put round and advertised and so on. And so I went
And since
over.
you were used to pulling up shop and moving across country,
Oh,
it was
yeah.
just one more jump across the
Yeah,
large pond
This was just
to
a
Scotland.
rather wet country. Yes.
Okay.
And so so I applied for it and got it.
Well, tell me, have you ever experienced any psychical phenomena yourself in trying to capture it in the lab, or any experiences?
Well, certainly I've off and on had some success in controlled laboratory studies and so on, both with PK and even with some free response ESP. Although for a while I wasn't so good at that, but I've had enough of that to have a sense of sort of what it's like to be a research participant. So that's been
Yes,
helpful.
which would be very helpful in an experimental
And
setup. Right?
and as far as in daily life circumstances, I had some unusual things happen to me when I was young, but in terms of reconstructing those, you always say, well, it will be reconstructed, and at the time I couldn't figure out, why X happened and so on, but maybe there was a reason. And so certainly I really first got introduced to sort of experimental parapsychology when I was a very young kid in my early teens. I was helping my parents clean out a closet, and in the back of it there was an aluminum box filled with 25 colored marbles, five of each different colors. And so it was an ESP and PK testing device whereby you rotated a knob, and every time you rotated it one full swoop, a marble would fall down. And so you either were trying to guess what color was going to come down or try to make a particular color come down. And that was a gizmo that had been built for my parents before I was born. And so
So is it safe to say that maybe you were drawn to the field Because of the experimental possibilities,
Oh,
not
very much.
necessarily because of the phenomena, or is it
Well,
really?
it was a mixture of both.
It's really,
I'd already been reading Fate magazine, you know, and
Uh-huh,
having kind of
okay.
a fascination with what
most
wasn't
adolescent
understood,
kids do, yeah.
and with a sense that really we seem to be very far from understanding of it. And so in conversations with my family about this little marble guessing box, I said, well, you know, do people really have these abilities? I didn't know enough then to statistically analyze it and have any sense that I had proven or disproven anything. And so they said, well, we think they do, but we don't know. Well, why don't you know? Well, because science doesn't know. Well, why doesn't science know?
Uh-huh.
And then
So is this where the hook was set at
that
this
was
point?
where the hook was set, because they said, well, as near as we can tell, they don't know because they're not even looking at it. And so that actually made me kind of angry. And that annoyance, I just even was recently realizing,
Really?
has been a dominant drive in my involvement with this field. And if we'd known all about psychic functioning and had very little idea about learning theory, I probably would have become a learning theorist and the heck with parapsychology, because other people were doing it.
Right.
And so the idea was, by all means, try to fill in. If, in fact, psychic functioning is not real, then we are deceiving ourselves in fairly complex ways, and we better learn that. Otherwise, we're really leading ourselves down the path. On the other hand, if it is real, and increasingly that looks to be the case to me, then by definition, our knowledge of ourselves is incredibly incomplete. And we'd better fill that in.
Definitely a question there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's always been the motivation. It's been less to kind of prove or disprove any kind of preconceived notion as to say, my goodness, science, you know, if you take
Get to the
yourself
bottom of this,
seriously,
in other words.
address these issues, because if you ignore them and then there's a bunch of rubbish floating about, don't complain about it, it's your bloody fault.
That's quite a in your face. I like I like that attitude. Well, I know you were kind enough to mention the foundation's little bit of assistance during your career. What was your primary contact with the foundation? How did you were just aware of the fact that the foundation and Eileen Garrett was out there and as a funding source? I mean, this was through your years at the Rhine, or how did you get involved with PF per se? And let me ask you also, did you actually meet Eileen Garrett or not?
Well, yes, I did. One time while actually the Rhine Center hadn't become the FRNM yet. I think maybe it had on paper, but it was still in the West Duke building on the East Duke campus with no air conditioning in the middle of hot North Carolina summers. And she came down to visit, and she was quite old at the time. This probably was about 1964, I would assume.
Yes, she died in 70, so it would have...
So this would have been relatively later years, and so she came down and paid a visit, as she often would. And so I think this was the first time I'd been around when she had come to visit. She didn't do it every year, but it was during the summer program, and so there were several of us there. I think Chuck Onerton was there, Rex Stanford was there, a few other people were there, and so we really were told at one moment, Mrs.
Look who's
Garrett,
coming to dinner,
Mrs.
that sort of
Garrett
thing?
would like to meet you.
Oh, Lord.
And
okay.
so she and JB emerged from
Inner sanctum, or
the
from their
inner
offices,
sanctum,
yeah.
and there we were, very much in the outer sanctum,
Yes.
and kind of almost in a little bit of a police lineup and so on. And so your grandma sort of came into the room, you know, wearing kind of a turban.
She wore a turban type
Yeah,
thing?
she was.
Oh, yeah,
She
okay,
was
with
indeed,
dangling
with
rings, yeah.
dingle-dangles and
Yeah,
so on,
yeah.
and that sort of steely-eyed gaze, and sort of went down the line from one side to the other, and kind of shook hand fairly slowly, because she was kind of frail, but sort of shook hand, you know, and looked into the eyes and so on, and went down through the end of us, you know, looking at each one and so on, and then she sort of turned around to JB, and she pointed to one of us and said, "That one."
What does that mean? To walk the plank?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, no, it was a positive thing. You know, I think she was saying, you know, that one seemed to have some, you know, special charisma and abilities and so on.
Really?
And that person will be walking through the door shortly. It was Rex.
Really? It was Rex. That was going to be, of course, my next question.
Yeah,
Ooh, a Ramon à
absolutely,
clé.
yeah.
This is exciting, yeah.
Yeah.
But you really never got to see her doing any psychic functioning
No,
because
that's
of her age, she'd probably...
That's right. That really was it. Unless, you know, I mean, at one level, she was, we assumed, trying to be psychic then. you know, in terms of sort of looking and saying, okay, what is the potential of this person, and so on. And so...
Either that or she was just trying to fix the name with the face and the grant
Well,
application. That's
right.
you know, in a because Garrett was very practical in addition to being highly psychic. Yeah, for sure. Well, I know you interacted then probably not with Garrett, but certainly with our president, Eileen Coly, because she would have been in the hot seat with the checkbook in the years that we were following your career. So.
Well, yes, and it was
Very different personality than Garrett, no?
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
Well, certainly from what I've heard, you know,
That's
and so on.
true.
And then really, I think I probably obviously knew the PF as a result of the Ryan connection, and then later on with Bill, because, you know, you'd had interactions with Bill and so on. And so it came to be then that when I would come up to New York City, that I would drop in to see yourselves and to see the ASP.
Parapsychology Foundation has always been very happy to back a winner, Bob. So in your case, for once, that was money very, very well spent. So do you have any thoughts on present-day parapsychological research? I mean, where you'd, almost like a wish list of where you'd, you know, like to optimally see it go, or any roads not taken that you regret and would like to shift it, or are you pretty...
Oh, it's really amazing, because I probably at some stage in my career will be regarded as having wasted more opportunities than anyone else around. There's just, I think in terms of where we should have been going and should be going, that we have to solve one of the main problems that psychology has had all along, which is how do you study really intense emotional circumstances in a way that's ethically responsible.
And psychology is facing the same.
Yes, that's right. I mean, much of its study of emotion really is kind of impoverished. And people like Paul Klein even wrote a book called sort of The Emperor's New Clothes about psychology's pretense at certain kinds of understanding, when in fact there were major areas of it that it really was not paying much attention to, one of which was parapsychology and one of which was real strong emotional experience. We've studied it in a way, you know, within kind of a clinical context. But there you've already got people that are in some sort of emotional difficulty.
Turmoil,
But,
too. How do you...
That's right.
Yeah, really...
And so many of the anecdotes, if you were to say, how does it show up in the real world, a large portion of them involve like crisis telepathy cases. And so, well, how do you get people in trouble remotely? Well, that's not terribly ethical. So I think there are a set of problems to solve there that we could be more creative at than we are right now. And it does mean making your case to ethics committees and so on. But it also means exploring things like training procedures and techniques. And it's one of the reasons why now I'm becoming much more involved in sports psychology.
Oh, really?
And
I wasn't aware of that.
I
Didn't
don't,
Rhea White do a book on
yes,
sports?
she did with
Yes.
Michael Murphy,
Yes.
Psychic Side of Sports, and she did a second edition of it as well. And of course, she almost went on to become a professional golfer.
Yes.
So. But we are finding, in one way of looking at parapsychology, is that it's the study of performance enhancement. It's the study of human performance, exceptional performance. And so I feel that we can learn a lot from what sports psychology is learning. Because when I did a survey of psychic development techniques and practices, and so I called it the Airport Project, because I had my students go out and read the kind of book you might find, you know, in the newsstand at an airport.
Okay,
and so
or
on.
at the beach, yeah.
At
That's
the
what
beach, yeah. And so we summarized the advice from over 70 such books. And there were many common themes that ran through them. And I was amazed at how much the common advice for psychic development really resembled a lot of the advice that was being given for Olympic class athletes. That it involved things like imagery enhancement, relaxation training, concentration and focus training,
Performance anxiety.
performance anxiety management, and so on. And so in some of the training work that we've done, which really is very little compared to what we should do, because it's very labor-intensive work and so on, and you have to select your participants pretty carefully and so on, because you are attempting to change their lives, and that carries some you know, ethical baggage with it always as well. Just as not changing lives can be ethically problematic as well, so it cuts both ways. But this is one of the kinds of areas that I think we should get more into, and it's one of the things, for instance, as you've mentioned, I've got a reputation now largely for being good at training people and helping many of them go on to take their doctorates and so on. But there's a downside to that, which is that by and large I've therefore had to encourage those people to be working in areas that are amongst some of the more conservative ones. And they've always needed to be learning how to be psychologists as well as parapsychologists and so on. And so generally their actual PhD work has been kind of, if you will, the precursor to what one would hope would be the truly imaginative,
Exactly, to get their foot in the door and then allow them.
That's right, and to be able to...
The dessert, as you mentioned before.
That's right, and to be able to play methodological show and tell, to learn the methodology and so on. And in Britain, we're under a fair amount of pressure now to have people complete in 4 years. Now that's 4 years of actual participation, you know, and which sometimes can spread out over more years if in fact you have personal circumstances that mean you have to interrupt that. But 4 years total is what we're really being encouraged to do. And so that then means that we've got to have people doing projects that can be wrapped up in 4 years.
That's difficult too.
And it is difficult, especially in an area where you want to be able to encourage people to really try some innovation, and with that the notion that sometimes you bark up the wrong tree. And you've got
So you have to have room to
bark up another
back
tree.
up and, yeah,
Exactly,
back up.
that's right, and to feel confident in that. And that's how science progresses anyways. And if in fact you're under some sort of pressure, if you bark it up a tree and there doesn't appear to be a possum up it, sometimes you have that pressure to continue to bark up the same tree just in case maybe there's...
Just in case.
in
Continue to
hope
shake that
that's
tree.
right.
Continue shaking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's, you know, that can be a mistake. And so I think this is a large part of what's, I hope, going to now be an addition, given that we have produced, you know, these 16-odd students, and there's at least 8, you know, still
Waiting
still
in the
on
wings
plate.
still.
And, you know, at any given moment, if we had enough funding to do it, I could add on at least 8 to 10
Really?
new
More, in addition?
top-notch students each year.
Each year?
Each year, absolutely.
Oh,
You know.
that's a crime without
Well,
funding.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we could in fact do that. I turn people away. I try to get them to other places and so on, with some success, because there's now 6 other places that are doing this at the universities in Britain.
Well, I thank you, Dr. Morris. I think you've given us lots to think about, and continued success in your endeavors.
Okay,
All right?
my pleasure.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. Hi there, I'm Lisette Coly. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.